أرحب بكم في الجلسة الثانية من هذا المؤتمر.
I'd like to welcome you at the second session of this conference entitled The Collapse of the Nation State and the Rise of Non-State Actors in the Fertile Crescent. So we have with us Dr. Haidar, Dr. Mohammed, Rumman, and Dr. Othman Mukhtar. We will start with Dr. Haidar Saeed and his contribution is entitled The Rising Role of the Shi'ite Groups in Light of the State's Retreat. Dr. Saeed is an Iraqi researcher who is also a consultant for the Iraqi Center for Strategic Studies in Amman, Jordan. His books on the politics of symbols was published in 2009. He's widely published in Iraqi affairs, and he has also earned a PhD in linguistics from Iraq's Almasri University in 2011. The floor is his. Dr. Haidar Saeed, you have 17 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, peace of God be upon you all. I would like to start with extending my thanks and my gratitude to the Center, the ACRPS Center for Research and Policy Studies, for the invite and also for the trust invested in me when it comes to taking part in this very important conference, trying to understand and decipher what our region is witnessing and living, and obviously a crisis that is critical. I'll be talking about the Shiite militias in Iraq and the logic of the failed state. The non-state armed groups, I mean by that the groups that are that use individuals and that we call usually militias, lead in Iraq to a failed state, and the more the state is failed in our region, i.e. the more it lacks legitimacy, the more it is incapable of giving services. And here I am, of course, basing my analysis on the international definition of a failed state. So when there is a lack of legitimacy, lack of services, especially in terms of security, militias arise because the security structure is weakened, and this leads to the failure of the state. We can say that there is proportionality between the strength of the state and the militia. The more the state is strong, the more it wants to monopolize really the influence and the power, and vice versa. So when the state is weak, it would allow or it would cover the movement and the growth of such groups. So the state thinks that the militias can play the role where itself it failed, and it can cover its weakness. These components would actually be a fertile ground for the establishment of militias. In Iraq, this general logic, of course, differs from what Iraq has known in terms of militias before 2003. They were the traditional type of militias, especially the two types that the region knows. The militia would be replacing the conventional army, or it can be really the armed wing of a party in the frame of a party life where violence is widespread. Here, when I'm in my paper, actually, which I'm reading, I analyze further the history of militias in Iraq, starting with the Levy forces established by the British when they occupied Iraq, all the way to the Popular Army established by the state in the 80s during the war with Iran, and also the different militias established by the traditional and conventional parties in Iraq, especially and starting with the Peshmerga established by the Kurdish parties. Post-2003, the political space allowed terms and conditions that would lead to militias. After the failure of the state and its security institutions, and in view of the ethnic division, there was an ideal ground for the establishment of militias that did not recognize the legitimacy of the state, like Sunni militias, or that were really filling the security void, like the Shi'ite militias. Many researchers think that militias are linked to the measures taken by the American occupier, especially the CPA. This is the term widely used actually. So the measures of de-Baathification and measures that targeted the army. In my opinion, it had to do with the ethnic groups and how they perceived a failure state. Jaysh al-Mahdi was established in July 2003, and here I will be focusing on al-Mahdi, Jaysh al-Mahdi militia, because it is really the pattern of Shiite militias in Iraq. I would say that most of them ended by now. They're not playing the efficient role like other Shiite militias. Now, many researchers try to understand why Jaysh al-Mahdi was established, why in July 2003. Some say that it was related to some measures taken by the American occupier, and I don't want to dwell on the details. Some said, however, that it was a reaction because this specific component was left aside, and at the same time there's another explanation that says that it explains really because it is a component that was from inside Iraq and not from outside Iraq, i.e. the Iraqi opposition. And also some milieus would say that Jaysh al-Mahdi was established by Mohammed in the 90s as a secret group. Anyway, Jaysh al-Mahdi expresses the failure of the state, and the logic of the failed state would always be the space where militias would rise. And that's why the timing when the state was established and when it was gathering its power, this timing specifically would lead to really belittling the role of militias, just like what happened after the African war against the Shiite militias in Basra and in the south of Iraq, and specifically Jaysh al-Mahdi in March 2008, when Prime Minister Maliki back then had the credo of the state of the rule of law, and vice versa. When the state is weak, militias would play a greater role, and this was a major crisis for Iraq when it comes to ISIL, known in Arabic as Daesh, and that controlled Mosul in the country in last June. So this incident specifically allowed Shiite militias to play their explicit roles, and the establishment and the rise of ISIL led to the establishment of new Shiite militias at the same time. These militias are now confronting ISIL realistically, and Falak Badr also played a very important role recently, and this means that the state is simply allowing these militias to fight and to confront ISIL. So this relationship between the militias and the state was expressed when the Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki visited Amirli village after the blockade, of course, and we saw the militias there, and Prime Minister Maliki was giving the statement, whereas the militias were replacing his own army. Jaysh al-Mahdi was the most important militia experience in the Shiite space, and they express really the pattern of these militias. I believe that it expresses the major features of the Shiite militias. First of all, these militias are linked to the failure and the weakness of the state. Second, another feature is the fact that they have always a partisan cover, and very often, as a matter of fact, the militias' function is greater, or they're actually in terms of security, they would have lesser party function, and vice versa again. I believe that the relationship between the political entity of al-Sadr movement and Jaysh al-Mahdi gives us a very important example in that sense. sense. When Jaysh al-Mahdi was defeated in the Al-Fursan war battle, as I said, they started to become a very strict party group, and they held in Istanbul in May 2009, dates are very important here, discussed how a party can be institutionalized. So the more the state gets stronger, the more the militias are really presented and restructured as parties, political parties. A third feature is that these parties have an ideological cover that tries to mobilize people, and many Shiite militias use the idea of the 12th Mahdi as a slogan. And in order to mobilize the people, in order to present themselves as a salvatory option. This is a very sensitive point, actually. When I say a Mahdi-based militia, it means that this militia presents itself as really linked to the Imam al-Mahdi itself, and these militias are not of that kind or under that category. And of course, when it comes to al-Mahdi idea here, this is a political credo that is used to mobilize the community. And it's not only Jaysh al-Mahdi. This idea goes beyond the protection, and it goes all the way to saying that these militias would be the source of justice after decades of injustice and marginalization. A fourth aspect is that the majority of these militias was really born in Iraq post-2003, and they tried to find an answer to the failure of the state, as I said earlier. This is a very important point, not only because it is a feature of the Shiite governance of Iraq post-2003, and also the Shiite opposition prior to 2003, but most importantly, these militias were born in Iraq and in the circumstances after 2003, which allowed them to mobilize in a very efficient and effective manner. And Jaysh al-Mahdi actually responded to two bombings in Samara in February 2006, and this showed us to what extent mobilization can be fast and quick. And even Faylaq Badr, that plays a very important role in the Shiite scene today, it was part of the Revolutionary Council in Iraq. Again, let me stay here between brackets. We do not have a study of Faylaq Badr today in 2014, whether there were any structural changes, and this group specifically compared to its experience prior to 2003. We don't have such a study. I believe that Faylaq Badr was restructured when it entered the country again post-2003. All these militias anyway have ties with regional powers, specifically Iran, when it comes to support and directives given, and also ties with Hezbollah in Lebanon in terms of training as well. So the Americans did not really pay attention to the rise of such Shiite militias, and with the CPA in 2004, in June 2004, so almost when the occupation was ending, their mission anyway in Iraq, when Order 91 was given, this order actually tackles militias and the integration of militias in the official and public security forces. This led to dealing with militias that were established outside and also opposition parties, former opposition parties. Anyway, this order has a list of militias. Most of them were actually the militias of the former Iraqi opposition, so prior to 2003. They did not take into account, obviously, the growth of such Shiite militias. This led to a movement that allowed the integration of Shiite militias in the nation's security forces, and it was an expression of confessional measures taken in the state. The objective of this integration, the purpose of this integration practiced by the Iraqi state was not like the objective of Order 1991, i.e. to limit violence or confessional violence, it was simply to give a formal touch to these militias without them changing their allegiance and their belonging to parties and to confessional groups all the way to the state. That's why these militias were widely present even inside the army and specifically the Ministry of Interior. That's why we saw that the Shiite militias had two major features, I would say. Their independence, first of all, and then their role within the Iraqi forces. Now, I'm going to tackle the fall of Mosul and the Shiite militias. I believe that this was a turning point, and 2008, so the Al-Fursan battle, to 2014, witnessed a very specific pace in when it comes to the Shiite militias. We know that the state started using certain Shiite militias at the aftermath of the political crisis, where the failed state was very obvious and the confessional division and the societal division as well was clear. Specifically, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, that was a Shiite militia and showed and had ties with the state itself. I'm not gonna dwell on this part. I would move on to saying that the Shiite militias prior to the fall of Mosul and before the control of ISIL of this region, so the Shiite militias wanted some kind of terror balance with Sunni radical groups, and this strategy probably stems from the experience of Hezbollah with Israel, and it matured even further with the war of 2006 with Al-Jaysh al-Mahdi, that believed that answering Al-Qaeda would be through this balance of terror. Some liberal Shiites wanted to root it even deeper. طيب ليش ضيعتني هيك حسنا هلا؟
وظلت الميليشيات الشيعية في السنوات اللاحقة تتبنى.
Again, the Shiite militias stick to this strategy, and we cannot say that the strategy changed, but after the fall of Mosul, ISIL was controlling the territory and announced the caliphate, and it was a door to full-fledged confrontation between ISIL and the Shiite groups. So again, the fall of Mosul was a change in the strategy of these Shiite militias. Again, so the fall of Mosul was very important, and now we see that a number of Shiite militias were, some were restructured, some were redesigned under new names after the fall of Mosul again. Here I'm really going through my paper very fast. I have a definition of the most important Shiite militias in Iraq, and the speaker is listing them obviously. Some of them have a role also in Syria. One last point that I think is very important in terms of fighting ISIL. I still have 3 minutes thanks to the generosity of the chair.
تضمن البرنامج الحكومي حكومة حيدر هذه نقطتين رئيسيتين وهما حصر السلاح بيد الدولة طبعا ما يعني نقض وجود الميليشيات ومسمى محلها وفكرة الحرس الوطني طبعا فكرة الحرس الوطني بالنسبة للاستراتيجية الأمريكية هي الركن الجوهري.
The idea of the National Guard in Iraq and the Free Syrian Army in Syria is more complicated than the National Guard in Iraq, but I will give a definition of the new National Guard. It is a military force made up of the nationals of each governorate to make it the backbone of dealing with the security issues in Iraq. This is an American idea. It's based on America's experience with the awakenings or sahwat, and to engage in the idea that no way you can stand up to ISIL in Iraq without the local Sunni tribes fighting. A year from now, General Petraeus wrote an important article under the title "How We Achieved Victory in Iraq" or something like that. He was responding to what was known in the literature in the West as the return of Al-Qaeda at the time. He said, General Petraeus said, any fight against ISIL should be a political and military strategy, and also they should rely on local militias and tribesmen, local Sunni tribesmen. The Americans wanted the National Guard to be former regular units right from the start, and it seems that this is based on a vision that there are real concerns. It does not make the National Guard more than a temporary, for now, a temporary part of the national strategy, which can be turned later into a total national strategy, because America wants to face the threat of ISIL and also to be part and parcel of the national strategy in each governorate. It's not based on the rebuilding trust in the national army, because the Iraqi society has lost confidence in the army and the security apparatus, and the Americans want to liberate that from the sectarian control. And it seems that the Americans see the National Guard a strategic way, and but critics see that contrary to what the Americans want, instead of creating a balance, this will create room for, I finished, I only want half a minute. In the Shi'ite way of thinking, they want their militias to be the backbone of the militias should be the basic component of the National Guard in the areas under ISIL's control and others, and they do not want their militia members to be absorbed into the army, but to be the backbone and the controller of these units. So therefore, they do not accept any talk of any disbandment of militias. They want these militias to stay in charge, and now it seems that there is nostalgia to the state which saw its demise after the American invasion. Thank you, Dr. Haidar Saeed, for this intervention. And also in his intervention, he talked about the demise of the state and the rise of the militias and how they are different than the traditional militia forces. And this came to existence as a result of the rise of the ISIL, and also what he talked about the new National Guard maybe calls for more debate in a year or two when new militias will be born as a result of the new programs by governments. Instead of searching for ways to rectify the situation of their failure, they probably end up establishing more militias. Now we have Dr. Mohammed Abu Rumman from the University of Jordan. He is a specialist in Islamic movements and has many books and articles to his name. and he also has written extensively on democratic change. He writes for Al-Ghad newspaper and many other Arab publications. He has a PhD in political science from Cairo University, and a month or two ago he published a book under the title I'm a Salafi, or I'm a Salafist. I give you Dr. Mohammed Abu Rumman. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I managed to bypass the problem faced by Dr. Falih Abdul Jabbar. I brought the paper for me as Plan B, but there is another crisis I find myself in. I don't want to read out the paper as it is, because I want this session to be like a brainstorming session. So I'll just mention some key ideas and concepts, and I hope that this will lead to a debate which will highlight other aspects and shed light on other issues. I'll be talking about ISIL as a regional player, and also talk about the general the situation in the area from the point of view of sociology. And we know the ISIL disappeared for a long time from the scene, from 2008, 2009, when it was on the retreat in Iraq, and until it almost completely disappeared, until people were surprised in April 2014 when al-Baghdadi started talking about the existence in Syria and Iraq and the announcement of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And this is something al-Jolani rejected, and Zawahiri agreed with him. People looked with a huge amount of skepticism and bewilderment, because this organization disappeared almost completely and suddenly came back into existence, not only in Iraq but in Syria, and almost immediately after started gaining control over large swathes of land in Mosul, Tikrit, and other areas. And then they announced the Islamic State or the Caliphate, and Al-Adnani started talking about the promise of God, the destruction of the Sykes-Picot borders, and this drew the attention of everybody in the world, and international and regional coalitions and alliances began to form to deal not with a local threat, but a transcendent threat which knows no borders, aims to expand beyond national borders. And many observers really have many questions on this military achievement, and also at the level of the media, when this organization provided a lot of content for the media to discuss through its ability to recruit people in the virtual and electronic environment, and also to attract not only fighters of Arab origin, but converts to Islam from Christianity, from Western backgrounds. I think this kind of sudden and very rapid appearance on the political and media arena has many consequences, and as it has been mentioned before, and that is the return of direct American military involvement to the region, and other military developments. In this debate, I will not talk about the dynamics of the development of this organization from Zarqawi, then Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, then Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and the fight with the awakenings. I leave that to Mr. al-Mukhtar, as I will not discuss this dynamism. I will also leave these details to move into important questions which are linked to the ability of this organization to recruit and attract fighters inside the Sunni communities in general. And I think there is an important question which needs to be dealt with and reconstructed to understand the dynamism of this organization and how it's developed, especially after the difficulties it faced after the killing of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. I think the involvement of some former Iraqi army officers made some difference, and also we try to answer the question how al-Nusra Front managed to deal positively with the requirements of dissemination in the society, and although that made al-Nusra fail and ISIL succeed in expanding its control, and it has some indications as to why the ISIL managed to achieve these results and what will the consequences be at the regional level. The first issue I'll be talking about is the rise of ISIL in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon is directly linked to the question of sectarianism in this area and the rise of sectarianism, in fact, in Iraq and Syria mainly, and Lebanon as a backyard. This is linked to the political vacuum in the Sunni community. Dr. Burhan Ghalioun talked about the political order, the regional political order, the Arab world, and this is linked to the rise of the unprecedented Iranian influence in the area and Iran's exploitation of the Shi'ite sectarian dimension in the politics of the region. And thirdly, when the struggle moved from political struggle into a struggle over the identity of people, sectarian and religious identity, the ethnic identity, especially when we talk about the Sunni community in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, which before the invasion of Mosul, there was a lot of debate that the Sunnis had existential worries in Syria, in Iraq and Lebanon with the rise of the Hezbollah, which began to threaten the Sunni identity in the absence of a real international intervention and the absence of a regional power at the time when the Iranian influence was on the rise. So a lot of the political discourse started talking about an occupation by the Iranian Safavid occupation. And there is an important book, Deborah Amos, which talks about the demise of the Sunnis and the crisis of the Sunni community in Iraq, and this gives us an indication as to why ISIL managed to secure these successes. because of these factors which are linked to the sectarian background, and it's important that we allude to a Sunni environment which acts as an incubator for ISIL, not because it wants to or chooses to, but because they have to. And we're not talking about something which is based on a maternal or paternal way of thinking, but what we're talking about is the large degree of recruitment which the ISIL managed to exercise in Sunni communities. And this may lead us to another question, and why has the sectarian issue has risen into prominence, and why are we talking about Sunnis and Shiites, about Kurds and Yazidis and others? In Jordan we have a joke that years ago nobody knew the difference between Shiites and Sunnis because people were not aware of this. Some Jordanians, if you ask about they used to confuse the word communist and Shiite, which sound similar in Arabic. In reply to this question, and this has been mentioned by other colleagues like Haidar, for example, he focused on an important issue, and that is the crisis of the failure of the national state, the post-colonial era, and its inability to absorb the different factions of society, and this violence by the state which reduced the violence within the communities. This is a political, historical phase, and this is linked to the Cold War era and post-colonial era. This kind of state has expired and is no longer able to provide an inclusive political framework to absorb all different factions and components of society. And this takes me back to what Dr. Azim Shara said this morning, and that is the Arab revolutions provided a historic opportunity for Arab society to achieve that and move that, but the counter-revolution after the militarization of the Arab revolutions, as what happened in Syria and Libya, and the solution which was almost like completely overtaking the Yemeni revolution, all of this led to the retreat of the exit point from the national state, and even the peaceful nature of the revolutions has lost its attraction in Arab societies. What is important now in this regard is the military coup which took place in Egypt. This military coup has ended the peacefulness of the democratic movement towards change and re-established the situation of violence in the area. So therefore, it's not shouldn't come as a surprise that the day after the fall of Muhammad Mursi and the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, in other words, the military coup, the day after, Ayman al-Zawahiri started in a recorded speech talking about how Al-Qaeda was right all along in rejecting democratic change, and Muhammad al-Adnani, the official spokesperson of the Islamic State, who criticized the Muslim Brotherhood of resorting to peaceful means, maybe Al-Qaeda felt threatened when the Arab Revolution was in its heyday and peaceful demonstration were the way chosen by the masses. In conclusion, the sectarian crisis in the Arab region, which is linked to the crisis of the failed states, these produce not only ISIL as an actor, whether at the regional level or local level, it in fact produces something even worse than that, because there is this can be studied through the sociology of Arab violence in this region. At a time when ISIL was on the rise, the Houthis were invading Sana'a and other parts of Yemen. Sinai Desert seeing growth in its terrorist activity. Hezbollah is on the rise. The armies, national armies, are collapsing with the speed of light. We're not talking about ISIL as the only actor so that we can focus on how to defeat it militarily. What we're talking about is the failure of the national state and the retreat of the national state and the rise of non-state actors in the Arab region in general. If this continues, one of the scenarios we can expect, the area is moving towards multiplication of the example of ISIL. We can defeat them militarily in Iraq and Syria. What about Libya? What about Sinai? What about the Houthis in Yemen? The last sentence, Muhammad, sorry. Last word, if I may, please. There is two important points. These movements amount to social protest movements with a religious ideology. Explaining them from a point of view of an ideology only is wrong. They are closer to social protest change, but they put on the complexion of ideological groups, because even in countries like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, which do not have the same problems as Syria and Iraq, these groups are flourishing in the areas where crime is on the rise and drug taking is on the rise, social problems are on the rise. The rise of these movements is a sign of the other phenomena. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad Abu Rumman. Dr. Muhammad Abu Rumman, he went beyond even the title of this paper as ISIL being a regional actor. He talked about the environment in which this kind of organization grow and flourish. He even described them as a social protest movement in an ideological framework and as a regional actor, and only because of the rise of sectarianism and the rise of Iranian influence and the absence of a regional catalyst for the Sunnis, and the Sunni communities found themselves obliged to accept ISIL. Now we move to Mr. Othman al-Mukhtar, who will be talking about the role of the ISIL since the protests in Anbar. Othman al-Mukhtar is the director of the Araby Jadeed newspaper in Baghdad. Before that, he was a senior correspondent for Washington Post until 2014. In addition to his journalistic work, he is a member of the Baghdad Center for Democracy Studies. and he is a visiting lecturer in the Anbar University, and he teaches at the War Media Institute, and he has written extensively on the American invasion of Iraq. He won an award from the United States. He holds a master's degree from Baghdad University.
So today I'm going to talk as an eyewitness, and I'm going to try to analyze what is taking place on the ground. My name is Mohammed Othman Rashid Al-Mukhtar, an Iraqi journalist from Al-Fallujah. Before coming here and meeting you here, I was in Tikrit and Fallujah and other towns of Iraq. So I have visited these areas. All of these areas are under the control of ISIL. That is why my intervention is going to be brief and realistic. So there is a very important point that I would like to mention here. None of the colleagues here or in other places have talked about this point. And I think ignoring this point would be inimical to many of the researches that are taking place vis-à-vis the ISIL and what is taking place. So very briefly, we have to understand that there is a difference between ISIL, the Syrian and the Iraqi wings. This is very important indeed, and it should be very clear to everybody. There are two wings to ISIL or to Daesh. Daesh or ISIL in Syria is different from Daesh in Iraq. So there is a difference if we try to study this phenomenon academically, and this will lead to many solutions on the Iraqi level, at least, for us to be able to deal with the ISIL. And I say dealing, and I would be very bold if I say dealing with ISIL. I insist that if we do not deal with ISIL, this would lead to repercussions that would last for 10 or 15 years. We have to understand ISIL. The more we understand ISIL, this is going to reduce the bloodshed and also the collapse of the infrastructure. So I'm going to talk and start directly because I do not want you to feel bored. So ISIL in Iraq is divided into three groups. We have the fighters, and I'm talking from a research standpoint. We have the Mujahideen, who have the ideology and also the objective. They are Daeshis par excellence. They believe in what they are doing, and these have been made by Al-Qaeda. They are Salafi jihadis from the Jihadi and Salafi sects. They have been influenced by Abdullah al-Azzam or the school of al-Zarqawi, and so on and so forth. So this group in ISIL is the leadership of ISIL. It is the body. It constitutes 30 to 50% of the body of ISIL. Most of them are very much known leaders of ISIL. They are Arab and Europeans. Most of them are non-Iraqis. We have a number of Arab countries who represent this group. I'm not going to refer to these countries because I would like to stick to the framework of my research. So this is the first group. This is the backbone of Daesh, which constitutes, once again, 30 to 50%. And I would like to talk about the second group, which is very much of interest when it comes to my research. And please forgive me if I speak in Iraqi dialect. If we understand the second group of Daesh, we would be able to find a solution, and we're going to be able to put an end to any, attacks and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going. Please allow me to have enough time. So the second group is the oppressed group. Daesh, according to a report which says the following, and this report was leaked by a center, by the American intelligence services, and it is a confidential classified report, and they say that ISIL in last February had only 3,000 people. So, and it is constituted from a number of countries. I'm not going to mention these countries. So this is 20 days before, and they have gone in excess of 40,000, and you will find them in most cities of Iraq, and you will find them in Anbar. And Anbar is one of the, pure Sunni provinces. It constitutes 30% of Iraq. Al-Anbar province is smaller than Jordan by 40 kilometers only. So Al-Anbar, Salah ad-Din, Nainawa, and Kirkuk, Al-Quds, and there are other cells of ISIL in the south of Iraq, and the report underlines that most of the fighters that have joined recently ISIL, we can reach a kind of agreement with them. There should be a kind of a governmental recognition saying that the Iraqi government, that they caused the expansion of this organization or of ISIL and the increase of their numbers. So in this report, it lacks the, it lacks the steps that should be followed. So it presented the problem and it talked about the problem, but it given any solutions or steps that should be followed on how to deal with the second group. So I'm going to go back to this second group. So this second group constitutes the majority of ISIL, and these are the oppressed people who have been detained in the different Iraqi prisons, in Al-Ja'fari government, and also the first and second Maliki governments up to today, and before that the occupation in Iraq. And these people who have been marginalized and have been marginalized throughout the last 8 years, and the Al-Maliki government has changed Sunni Iraqis to second-class citizens. I do not agree with that, and I'm talking here about in excess of 30 million Sunni Iraqis. They have been transformed into second-class citizens. So this second category, they constitute the majority. So they feed on retaliation, on hatred. They are used knowing that people who use them would be harmed by that, but they insist on continuing with ISIL until they finish with their retaliation and revenge. Revenge against whom? Against those who marginalize them. So this category of people in ISIL, we can reach an agreement with them. We are going to have researchers about this topic. So this is, as I said, is the most important component of Daesh. So this category is very fierce in battlefield. We call them in Iraq wikhin, which means they are very, very fierce, very talented. They have their own military plans, and they are the backbone of ISIL. So these are the people who have been downtrodden, and they wanted to run away from the things that have been practiced against them by the government. And there is another group, which is the new group. They call them the new group. They are different from each other. And I'm going to talk about things that I have seen with my own eye, with what I have seen days ago in Al-Fallujah. So this category of people believes in the continuation of the fighting, but they do not believe in Al-Khilafah or Caliphate. So please, we would like to underline this. So there is one component that fights with Daesh and it can kill or can be killed, but at the same time, this component, this category do not believe in Al-Khilafah or the Caliphate state. They do not believe in suicide attacks or bombing. So these are part of Daesh. There is an article by Michel Aflak who says that all Iraqis are Ba'athis, even if they are not, affiliated with the Al-Ba'ath party. My name is Othman, believe me. My ID, my name on the ID is Othman Rashid. When I go to Baghdad, I hide this ID and I use my journalist ID written in English because most of the soldiers, they do not read English, so it's much safer for me in that sense. So these people are part of Daesh. They try to hide themselves because they would try to, let's say, smoke cigarettes and try to do that by hiding behind a tree or whatever. They do not want the emir to see them. So these people are not Daeshi. So these people, they have certain circumstances or a certain destiny that have pushed them to join Daesh. Like Tariq Boulziyad said, that your enemy is behind you, the sea is in front of you. So the government that was brought by the United States has not left any solution for the Iraqis but to use weapons. So myself as a journalist, and from what I see, I swear to God that when I reach and go to certain areas in Iraq, I feel very bad and I cry. There were so many, crimes against humanity have been committed, rapes, torture have been committed in Iraq. So the Iraqi citizens, 230 people, beat four four divisions. How can that happen? So you went to an area called Zoba, which is 20 kilometers from far from Baghdad. When I went to that area, people told me that they started kissing the hand and begging people and telling them, please give us weapons. So they were kissing the hands and begging people from Daesh, from ISIL. I think this category of people, we can agree with them, we can talk to them, we can hold dialogue with them. So in case we are able to start dialogue with ISIL, we're going to solve many of the issues and the problems, and we can put an end to the bloodshed. So this category, it constitutes the majority. The third category are those who have interest, those who want to go back to the era prior to 2003, although this is not an influential category, but they are can influence the media, they can have some influence on certain regions. And we have seen many tensions between ISIL and between other Salafi groups, such as groups and other sects, such as the 20th Revolution brigades. So we have so many clashes between themselves and other groups. So I cannot deal with that and give you more details due to the time constraints. And we have other reports. We have the reports by the Ministry of Defense and that was issued in May. They said that this dynamism in Anbar, after the fall of Fallujah, they stayed for 20 days as a sectarian fight against the government. We haven't seen any decapitations, any killings, as it was the case in Mosul. On the contrary, we have heard in the media that they would imprison the government soldiers and make them wear, traditional robes and ask them to go back home. And after we're going to go back now to the Al-Sistani fatwa in June, when he talked about he talked about his fatwa, and we have seen an increase, a huge increase in the number of soldiers, especially that when Iraq was occupied, he didn't issue any fatwa, and when this problem started, he issued a fatwa. So the Daesh occupation led him to issue a fatwa, but when Iraq was occupied, he did not issue a fatwa. There is a quotation by one of the Arab nationalists. It was a Catholic Christian Iraqi person who told me a few days ago, it is unfortunate that the Arab world would have such fighters such as Daesh or ISIL, against which the alliance is trying to fight in. I think their path was deviated. Such youth, we could use them to liberate Palestine. This research, the process of developing, of expanding, there are people, I have to tell you, that we can agree with them to put an end to the killing. So many families have been moved away. Everybody talked about Koban. Everybody talked about Al-Yazidin without going and saying that 13 million Sunnis have been killed. There are 4 million Sunnis outside Iraq, and many have been displaced. 435 have been detained. Thousands of women have been detained also and imprisoned. I wish I had enough time to explain this. These things can not lead to a political party. These things can lead only to catastrophes. I am considered one of the intellectuals in Iraq. When I went to Fallujah, I saw a number of friends. One of them is a university lecturer whose son was killed at the age of 6, and he only got that son, after having IVF treatment. So a week before I saw him, he used to attack Daesh. But when I went to see him, he told me these people are good people. So can you see the amount of pressure on Iraqi Sunnis for them to join such kind of armed dynamism? I do not justify this. We know that ISIL threatens Iraq that I love and hold very dear to my heart. But we have to, if we say that there are 40 fighters in Daesh are fighters, I can say that, so 40,000, we can say that 30,000 of them have used weapons because they were forced to do so, and we can convince them to not to use the weapons. So we can, through dialogue, through sitting with these people, these 30,000, we can reach an agreement with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Othman al-Mukhtar, who through his own eyewitness accounts and visits to the areas under the control of the ISIL has enlightened us with the major differences between the ISIL of Iraq and the ISIL of Syria, and the 3 different types first, the true believers in the ideology of the ISIL, and the second, the oppressed, as you call them, who are the normal Iraqis who are subjected to violations of human rights, gross violations by the Americans first, and then the Shi'ite ruling government of Iraq, and thirdly, the opportunistic members of the ISIL who want to take Iraq back to the pre-invasion of 2003. We open the floor for discussions now.
Thank you very much. Andreas Krieg from King's College London, and working for the Joint Command and Staff College of the Qatari Armed Forces. I just came back from Iraq myself last week, actually, and I've visited various parts of the front line with Daesh. I think the fundamental problem here that we're facing, and I agree with the speakers, is that in Iraq we're having a marginalized part of the society who are now trying to get back at what they see the big enemy, which is the government in Baghdad. The question is, how do we want to move forward when we talk about Iraq? Do we want to have a unitary nation state? Do we believe that Iraq can exist as an integrated nation state, or are we actually thinking outside the box and thinking maybe we want to split it up, or we want to have more federalism? If we go for the option of a unitary nation state, I've been approached by a couple of parliamentarians from the Baghdad government, as well as some Baathists who didn't join Daesh, but actually thinking about how they can fight Daesh, people who believe in the unitary Iraq. So the people from the Wataniya bloc that I met last week showed me a couple of proposals for this National Guard, and I think the National Guard is a very interesting concept. Obviously, it has been put forward by the Americans, but there are a lot of people in Iraq who believe in the unitary state of Iraq, and who believe that if we want this unitary state, we need to create a security sector which is unitary and inclusive. And I think this is the key aspect here for both Syria and Iraq. If we want stability, we need to have a security sector that is able to provide security inclusively. I've been to various villages in Kurdistan and Nineveh province, and also further south, and every village now have their own militias. We're having now a situation whereby we're not only, the division is not only Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, the division is I'm Turkmen, I'm Assyrian, and so on and so forth. You have even subdivisions. So the imagined community, which in the past, I would argue, there's never been a nation state in the Arab world anyway, because a nation state is supposed to be an inclusive nation state. It's never existed. But definitely where we are in Iraq right now, the state has completely ceased to exist. It's completely failed, and socio-political organization is now basically created very much on the local level. Every village has their own militia. It goes that far that some of the Assyrian villages and Yazidi villages don't even trust the Peshmerga to provide security for them, leave alone the Baghdadi government. So how do we integrate all these people who are armed now and who are still thinking that really, I mean, we cannot exist on our own and we need the state of Iraq? So how can we move forward and create a unitary and inclusive security sector? And I think the answer to that could be the National Guard. The problem, as Mr. Said, Dr. Said was mentioning earlier, the problem is how do we integrate these kind of militias? How do we allow them to be part of an umbrella which is controlled from Baghdad, from a unitary government, and then somewhat divorce them from their personal loyalties and affiliations with their commanders, which is something that will continue to exist. And this is one of the major challenges. I would just like to pick your brain on how you think this whole National Guard idea could move forward, because I'm in the process now of reaching out to the British government and try to convince them that this National Guard thing might be actually a good way forward, and that we should support those people in Iraq who are supporting this idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the panelists, and thank you, Mr. Al-Mukhtar, who provided us with this direct picture he painted, and I know he speaks from the heart. But I want him to tell me, to elaborate a little bit between the differences between ISIL of Iraq and ISIL of Syria. Rawa Uja from Al Jazeera. I have more than one question, Mr. Othman. When we talk about dialogue with ISIL because the vast majority of its membership is made up the oppressed. How can we achieve that if the backbone is against the idea? The oppressed, as we talk, when in the Anbar movement, peaceful movement for more than 1 year, they had the same demands as the tribes are calling for now. Until now, nothing has happened. The tribes are still saying that the central government in Iraq is completely ignoring them. Do you think Abadi, the new prime minister, will be responding positively to these demands? And is the threat of ISIL be a factor to reunite Iraq now and make the government respond to the Sunni demands? A question to Mr. Haidar. In view of the existence of these so many different Shi'ite militias and the Kurdish Peshmergas, how can we possibly unite our ranks against ISIL? How can we possibly have a united or unified Iraq? The federal solution has already failed, and we do not want to talk about division. How can the solution still remain in a unified Iraq in view of these circumstances? Tariq Al-Zumar, I'm the president of the Development and Building Party in Egypt. I want to say that ISIL does not represent a mainstream in the Islamic movements. What's happening now is to turn ISIL into the mainstream. In my opinion, this is a plan aimed at surrounding the Islamic movements, and once that is done, exercise control over the area. This does not mean to say that ISIL is not extremist. In fact, they represent the worst and the extremist form of takfiri way of thinking, which came into existence in Egypt under extreme oppression by the state in Egypt, and in Iraq it's that plus the marginalization and exclusion of Sunnis. So therefore there is an attempt to exploit this phenomena of ISIL to strengthen the hand of foreign intervention on the one hand and the totalitarian regimes and despotic regimes which suffered when the Arab Revolution started. Nizar Haraki, in the name of God, thank you to the Arab Center and the panelists. I think Mr. Othman is simplifying that 30,000 out of 40,000 can be talked into some sense is an oversimplification. I think we must not forget the real crisis and the double standards and the East and West, Islam and political Islam, Arabs and other ethnicities. We require real research and study and an invitation to all Arab countries. Iran's terrorism, which goes beyond any borders, the terrorism of Hezbollah, the terrorism of Iraqi militias, the terrorism of the Maliki regime, has led to ISIL recruiting more than 40,000 people. To say that terrorism has one face and that's only ISIL is wrong. There is the terrorism of other states and powers which contributed to creating the conducive environment for the appearance of ISIL and provides a fertile ground for the likes of ISIL. I have two questions, one to Mohammed Abu Rumman. Does he agree with differences between ISIL of Iraq and ISIL of Syria? If he does, fine. If he doesn't, why not? A question to Mr. Othman. This dialogue you propose as a solution, what if this dialogue does not take place? Can you give us an idea of how will society be and how life will be under ISIL? Because most of their recruits seem to be from the young nowadays.
Good morning, my name is Rumman. I'm also from King's College London and working for the Qatari National Defense College here. My question regarding foreign fighters. You mentioned that about 35 to 40% are people that have been trained before, but what we're witnessing right now is a huge influx of foreign fighters coming from Europe. So I'd like to know how you would like to deal with these people, most of them very young and inexperienced, and what's the prospect for dealing with them in the future?
In the name of God, we must not forget that ISIL's rise in this short period of time has raised many question marks which are still persist, and most of the analyses we hear do not seem to reveal anything as to the secrets behind that, and is not revealing, is not removing the shroud of mystery which surrounds this ISIL. My question is to Mr. Othman al-Mukhtar. Don't the Sunnis in Iraq think that any victories, even moral ones, achieved are nothing more than imagined one and temporary, because the international alliance against ISIL is not serious, but it's the American sponsor is benefiting from this alliance to make some temporary gains, and when they want to get rid of ISIL, they will do so immediately, similarly to what they did to Al-Qaeda. Do the Sunnis understand this? Director of Hawiyati Center, the picture that Mr. Othman has painted explains the inability to understand things by the leadership of ISIL. In the morning, Azmi Bshara tried to explain to us in the past these movements wanted to only exercise violence to achieve objectives. ISIL wants to build a state. I think they do not want to do that because they simply can't. First of all, they did not move eastwards towards Iran, they did not move towards Baghdad, they did not move towards Iran, towards Saudi Arabia, and some people are saying that they have, the arms they have are made in China. I don't know where they got that from. So I asked Mr. Uthman Mukhtar and Mr. Mohammed Abu Rumman, This organization is playing a very active role, and the only beneficiaries are Bashar al-Assad, secondly Iran, thirdly the Western project or America, which finds a pretext and a justification to interfere again and also to justify violence against the Arab Spring. Don't you see that there are many vague points which needs to be explained?
Thank you very much. A quick question to Mr. Haidar Saeed. Your name, please. Hussein Dalli, journalist from Al Jazeera. Why does the Iraqi parliament insist not to issue a legislation regarding the National Guard? Why does Al-Ibadi insist why does he insist on refusing the intervention of the alliance or other countries in Iraq? Another question. I have a reservation regarding what you said in your intervention, Mr. Mohammed Rumman. When you talked, you said that these organizations, they emanate from a number of incubators or communities in which there are problems such as crimes and so on and so forth. I have to tell you that many of the affiliates are graduates, they have degrees. So maybe if you said that 10 years ago, that would be maybe true, but now I don't think it is that right to say that. Ahmed Arif from Qatar Foundation. My first question to Dr. Mohammed Rumman. You delineated a general picture about the region. You talked about the different coups that took place and also the lack of any possibility of a peaceful solution, which has led to the appearance of a number of movements such as Daesh and other movements in other regions, such as the Houthis in Yemen. In the light of this, how can we see the possibilities and the future scenarios that can take place? Any possibility of peaceful solutions? Is this not possible in the near run? Or is it only, are we going only to have kind of counter revolutions and coups in the future? And in that case, social change, what are the possibilities for social change in that case? My second question is to Mohammed Othman. You talked about the third category of Daesh in Iraq, which are the opportunistic fighters or those who have interest in the fighting. What kind of interest are you talking about? Can you explain more? And can you I mean, if there is time to give us just an idea about the other component of Daesh, which is the Syrian wing of ISIL, please. Ayad Dlimi, as journalist and writer, from the discussions that took place so far, I think that we did not talk about the nature of ISIL. I was hoping that my colleague Mohammed Othman al-Mukhtar to give us an idea about the source of ISIL from the organizations and from what we have followed. I mean, I think that this ISIL emanated from Al-Qaeda. Maybe they have a political vision, and those who say that they do not have a political vision, I disagree with them. They have many active members and they have financing as well. They have financial resources. So I think what Mr. Mohammed al-Mukhtar said, he doesn't mean that we have to sit and have dialogue. I think that what we need to do is try to respond to the demands of the oppressed. When you try to respond to the demands of the oppressed people in ISIL, you're going to, make ISIL weaker. So now, after this revolution. I would like, they want to tell to peaceful people, this is what your peaceful revolution has led to. So what is taking place, many of the things are absent, are unknown, because we do not know what is taking place exactly. And the question is, the United States and the international alliance, are they really ready to fight this ISIL? Are they trying, is the United States trying to occupy once again Iraq through ISIL? Thank you. I would like Mr. Al-Bayari, Mr. Dr. Mohammed Abu Rumman, he talked about social protestation, and Daesh, has a component which is representing a kind of a social protest, and this is not true. In the literature of Daesh or the different statements by Daesh, these statements do not show that they have a kind of a social project or trying to solve any of the issues. And the same question has to do with the point that was referred to by Mr. Othman, when he talked about the different incubators in which Daesh appeared. We feel that there is a kind of a spirit of revenge and retaliation. Many of the people in those regions are desperate. That is why they have tried to join Daesh, because there are no other political or social components that can respond to the worries of those people, and consequently they found themselves only with Daesh and joining Daesh as a result of that. Khalid Ad-Dghaim, journalist in Al Jazeera. I am a bit surprised that many of you said that ISIL is mainly represented by oppressed people, and only oppressed people have joined the ISIL. I think oppressed people should try to lift oppression on other people and not to be partner and part of oppression to be practiced and on other people. I think Daesh is one of it is one of the alliances against Syria. As for the divisions, yes, maybe the map is different, but from what we have seen on the ground, we have divided the map into Takfiris and Khawarij as part of this group or ISIL, and these are the decision makers. And after that, we have the military commanders, and the third component is the fighters. The fighters are divided into 3 categories. We have the very enthusiastic youth who see in the Daesh slogans something very attractive. So when the Free Army did not find any weapons, Daesh would go to these groups and try to give them weapons, and as a result of that, these people from the Free Army joined Daesh. So many people from the Free Army have joined Daesh. The third category, we have seen them on the ground. These are thieves, gangsters, thugs who have joined the Daesh to protect themselves from any, security apparatus, maybe that would be following them as a result of the crimes they have committed. Thank you. Zuhair Hamdi, researcher in the Arab Center for Research. I have got 2 questions. One question to Dr. Mukhtar. The first question, I would like to concentrate on the second category, which are the oppressed people. Are you talking about the tribes? You talked about individuals, but these individuals are part of the Iraqi society. Are they part of any particular tribes? We have talked about many tribes in Iraq. The second question is also to Dr. Mukhtar. since you have visited many of the regions that are under the control of ISIL, what is the administrative organization or plan that is followed? From what I have read, the administration method followed by Daesh is different from any other organizations. It is a kind of a centralized administration, regime that is different from any other organization. Is that true? Is that right? Last question, please. Tariq al-Rifai, journalist from Al Jazeera. One of the priorities of Daesh is to fight the infidels after they establish the Islamic Caliphate. So this is very important for Daesh and for the Daesh ideas and ideology. So they want to combat the infidels. So we know that there are many European members, who have been enlisted, who have enlisted in Daesh, and so why now, during the Arab Revolution, which is a timing which is, very far away from the 9th of September, 11th of September? We have 23 questions that have been posed so far, and we would like now to give the panelists the opportunity to answer the questions. We're going to give the floor to Mr. Othman Mukhtar to start answering the questions. So the lady who talked about dialogue, I think that I was misunderstood. Daesh, as an organization, it does not believe in dialogue, and it would not accept dialogue. They prefer the language of weapons, of violence, rather than the dialogue. But I talked about that particular category within Daesh, within ISIL, who can be isolated from the leadership, from the commanders of this ISIL, by giving Sunnis their rights, by removing oppression, by putting an end to the injustices that took place. So, as an example, amongst the 14 demands that have been forwarded by the revolutionaries at the beginning of this year, these demands have not been met by any response, including the release of 3,000, in excess of 3,000 women, and also the amendment of the constitution, and also the and also the Iraqi civil law. I am, let's say, Shi'ite. I am a Shi'ite, and my brother is a Sunni. So there should be laws that have been followed for scores of years in Iraq. Now we have, many laws that have been presented, such as Sabi'iyya and Christian laws and other laws. So we have 14 or 15 demands by Sunnis. If they are So Al-Maliki himself said that most of these demands are not unconstitutional. So why wouldn't we meet these demands and respond to these demands? So if we try to respond and try to meet their demands and try to realize what they want to have realized, many of the people who have joined Daesh would leave Daesh or ISIL. So I think ISIL, they have a kind of a justification that they give to people for them to join Daesh, oppression and so on and so forth. because many of the Sunnis, they fear the Shiite militias, they fear a kind of Irani intervention. Yes, I have to tell you that many of Sunnis in Iraq, they do not want Daesh, but because of the fear of Iran, they would not stand against ISIL. So this is for the first question. So, and I think we can find solutions here. The second point, yes, Sunnis in Iraq, yes, they lack a proper leadership. Yes, this is true. Yes, the Kurds have good leaders who are followed by the Kurds. The Shiite also, they have their own religious references and political leaders. And the Sunnis, if you talk to a tribal leader and you ask him, can you bring, let's say, 10 men with you to a certain place, he wouldn't do that to you because they're just not, good leaders. So Sunni leaders, most of them either have left Iraq or have been killed. So we had one of the brigadier pilots in Iraq who was killed recently. This person was, whose word was heard by his own people, who was followed by his own tribe. He was killed only because he did attack one of the regions in Iraq in the 80s of the 20th century. So, yes, there was another question about revenge and retaliation. There isn't a Sunni Shiite revenge. Believe me, when I used to live in Baghdad, my neighbor used to be Shiite. And when I left my house in Baghdad, I left my house keys with my neighbor who is Shiite. We used to sit together. We used to spend, the nights talking to each other. But I have to tell you that it is people who have joined Daesh, they take revenge against people from the government and vice versa. And the armed militias also, they try to take revenge because they think that anybody who has joined Daesh should be fought. Within the communities, within the different people and individuals in society, we do not have any revenge. And we have so many reports in this respect. You can see them. We were able to change a little bit the image that has been disseminated. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Othman. I know that time is very limited, so I'm going. So many of the questions, they require a lot of discussion, so I'm going to give just quick answers to the questions that have been posed. So we're going to have maybe other discussions outside the room. Yes, there are differences. This is the question posed by Mrs. Fatma. It has to do with the transformation that is taking place. Daesh was impeded before, but in Syria, many of the fighters were volunteers who came from outside Syria. And this has led to a difference between both Daesh or ISIL in Syria and the wing in Iraq. So many of the Iraqis who have joined this has led to a difference. You can see the behavior is different between the different ISILs in Syria and Iraq. So not all Daeshis are Daeshis ideologically. Even in Syria, many of the people who have joined the ISIL in Syria, due to the military strength and due to the security chaos in Syria, even Jabhat al-Nusra, that was in a disagreement with Daesh, many have defected in their Zor and joined Daesh or ISIL in Syria. So ISIL today, we find that many of the Syrians are joining ISIL due maybe to the expertise, and this maybe answered the question that was posed by Mr. Ayad because of the expertise. But in Syria, Syrians are not on par when it comes to the potential and the abilities that we find in Iraq. I was talking about the countries in which we find, Salafism, such as Jordan and Morocco and so on. In such incubator, in such environments, you find, the use of drugs and crimes and so on. Even in Morocco, due to the political problems in the Arab world, we have seen many academics and many PhD holders have started joining these currents, and they have started even believing in their ideology. And this leads me to the question that was posed by Mr. Ma'an when he talked about social protests. When we talk about social protests, what is meant by that, it is a kind of a protest against oppression, against marginalization, against injustices. So these groups have tried to take this ideology under the umbrella of Daesh or ISIL, but there are a number of objective reasons. It is not necessarily the ideology that have led these individuals to enlist and join ISIL. There was another question who disagreed with Mr. or Dr. Azmi Bshara. ISIL, the difference between ISIL and Al-Qaeda, its priority is against the United States. It did never thought about establishing a state. And this is different from Daesh because they believe in having an emirate. That is why they want to have a kind of a purgation and try to have a number of principles that should be adopted that would lead to the establishment of an Islamic state, as it was explained by so many scholars. So why does Daesh, they have left the Syrian regime and other external members, they have not fought them. This is due to the development that we have seen in ISIL. They had a strategy. They said they wanted to kill and use 9 bullets against despots, against apostates, and only 1 bullet against the despots. So this is different. This is due to their ideology. It is similar to the war against apostates that used to take place in the past. Al-Qaeda, the main enemy for them is the United States, but for Daesh it's different. It's a transformation due to the changes that have taken place in the Arab region. Maybe Dr. Mukhtar alluded to that when he talked about dialogue. He didn't mean that we should sit with them and talk to them. No, we have to try to meet the demands of the people who have joined Daesh, including the members of the Free Army, and try to solve issues such as the National Guard in Iraq. One of the writers in the Washington Post said that it is the local Syrian society is going to be the main component in order to fight Daesh.
شكرا دكتور محمد. يعني الحديث توسع كثيرا.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. We expanded into many detailed issues. I'll try and focus on this issue. I personally think the area, and Iraq is part of it, has witnessed since the beginning of the 20th century competition between different identities. The national state could not get rid of that. It enhanced it. In 2003, what happened in Iraq? The United States wanted to give a different definition of Iraq. Instead of one national state, into a state made up of different identities. This led to failure for more than one reason. First of all, this competition between different identities And after 2003, there was no system in Iraq. Iraq is not a federal country, really. There was an attempt by the majority or the central government to redefine federalism, because Iraq is not a federalist state similarly to the United States or Germany. Iraq is a central, is a country much like Spain and Italy, with one centralized country but with one district or region which has special or peculiar status. We should have this diversity in Iraq should have a national cover. There was a gap in Iraq which led to ISIL. In 2010, ISIL was good as dead in Iraq. But the crisis created by Maliki's government helped or contributed to create ISIL. ISIL had a strategic report published. It's about 350 pages at the days of Abu Umar al-Baghdadi. They started reorganizing their ranks, and the systematic oppression of the Sunni community created ISIL. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, yesterday I differed with Dr. Mohammed on this. In Iraq, Iraqi ISIL, there's a confusion between ISIL and the ideology. What we are seeing in Iraq is a mixture between political Sunnism with Salafi jihadism, and every word they use is more or less with words and ideology. He uses things like this battle is the battle of Sunnis against the Safavids. And I have no guarantees to offer, but the solution, it seems to me, is to solve these two failures, to reintegrate the other identities into the establishment of the government, and to rebuild nation building in the way in which it's done in the classic sense. As for the National Guard, there is a draft resolution before the parliament. Abadi is not denying that, or he's only saying it has problems. This is a very dangerous one. Ultimately, you cannot face Al-Qaeda or ISIL. The Americans couldn't do that. Only the local communities can do that. But this National Guard will only lead to one thing: to create an army for each area or each governorate, and they want the Shiites to control it. I think I want this National Guard to be a strategic, temporary, only for a certain stage, but the ultimate solution is rebuilding confidence in the original Iraqi army. I'm sure the center will try and do something about the National Guard. I would like to thank all our panelists, Dr. Haidar, Dr. Muhammad Rumman, Dr. Othman al-Mukhtar, for this excellent session. We had very informative discussion. Thank you all.